In the early 19th century, Cambodia was a kingdom caught in a storm of foreign ambition, no longer the grand empire of Angkor. It had become a battleground where powerful neighbors fought not for justice, but for control. Siam, hungry for dominance, launched major military campaigns in 1831 and again in 1840, Cambodia strewn in its image. These were not mere battles of swords and muskets, they were invasions cloaked in diplomacy, wars waged through puppet kings, and occupations disguised as protection. This is the untold story of how Siam, refusing to accept defeat, returned again and again to dominate Cambodia. Despite resistance from the Khmer people and interference from Vietnam, Ayutthaya's successor, Rattanakosin, kingdom relentlessly pursued its goal: to turn Cambodia into a vassal state under its control. In this three-part documentary, we dive deep into the invasions, the political manipulations, and the suffering endured by a nation fighting to remain its own. Part 1. The 1831 to 1834 Offensive Siam's bid to reclaim control. The roots of the 1831 Siamese invasion of Cambodia lie in the bitter history of rivalry between Siam and Vietnam. Throughout the 18th century, Cambodia had been dragged into the middle of these two expanding empires. Neither power wanted to outright colonize the Khmer kingdom. Instead, they aimed to dominate it through puppet monarchs, tribute demands, and military presence. By the 1820s, Vietnam had gained the upper hand. After helping King Ang Chan II reclaim his throne from rebellious pro-Siamese princes, the Vietnamese court in Huc gradually extended its control over Cambodian politics. Vietnamese troops were stationed in Phnom Penh. Vietnamese customs began replacing traditional Khmer ones. Even the Khmer royal household became dependent on Vietnamese advisors and protection. This increasing influence did not sit well in Bangkok. King Rama III, who came to power in 1824, was determined to reassert Siam's authority in Cambodia and push back against what he saw as Vietnamese expansionism. He saw the growing Vietnamese presence in Cambodia as both a threat and a humiliation. Once the dominant regional power was now watching from the sidelines as its former vassals slipped into Vietnam's orbit. In 1831, that would change. Siam launched a massive military campaign into Cambodia. The official justification was to restore balance and support alternative Khmer claimants to the throne. In truth, the goal was clear: remove Vietnamese influence by force and install a Cambodian king who would answer to Bangkok. The offensive began with Siamese troops marching into Battambang and then advancing east towards central Cambodia. They were joined by Khmer forces loyal to Prince Angim and Ang Duongbo, considered potential replacements for the reigning king, Ang Chan, who had aligned himself with the Vietnamese. These princes had spent years in Bangkok and were favored by the Siamese as more obedient alternatives. As the Siamese approached Phnom Penh, Vietnamese troops stationed in the city dug in for battle. What followed was not just a conventional war, but a bitter guerrilla struggle. The Vietnamese, led by the capable General Trong Minh Giang, had entrenched themselves in fortresses along the Mekong and Basak rivers. Despite being outnumbered, they resisted the Siamese advance fiercely. Khmer civilians were caught in the middle. Villages were burned as Siamese troops suspected locals of collaborating with Vietnamese forces. Those suspected of supporting Siam were imprisoned or executed by Vietnamese troops. Thousands of Khmer fled into the forests. Others were forced to serve as porters or soldiers, drafted against their will into the armies of foreign empires fighting over their homeland. Throughout 1832 and 1833, the war raged on with no decisive victory. Siamese forces were able to occupy parts of northwestern Cambodia and lay siege to Vietnamese positions, but they couldn't drive the Vietnamese completely out. The geography of Cambodia with its rivers, dense forests, and wet climate made large-scale movement difficult and slowed both armies. Meanwhile, in southern Vietnam, another front of resistance was forming. The Lavon Key Rebellion broke out in Saigon against Emperor Min Mnang's centralizing policies. Siam hoped to use this chaos to its advantage. It launched attacks not only into Cambodia, but into southern Vietnam itself, trying to destabilize the New Yan regime. But these hopes were short. The Vietnamese crushed the rebellion in Saigon by 1834. With their southern flank secure, they redirected full military attention to Cambodia. In early 1834, Vietnamese forces launched a powerful counteroffensive. They drove Siamese troops back across the Mekong and reclaimed much of the territory they had lost. Siamese supply lines stretched thin and Khmer supporters of the Siamese princes, realizing the tide had turned, fled or surrendered. By mid-1834, the Siamese campaign had failed. Cambodian territory remained under Vietnamese influence. Trong Minh Giang declared the formal annexation of Cambodia into the Vietnamese Empire, turning it into a province known as Tern Te, or Western Commandery. The symbolic meaning of this was enormous. For the first time in history, Cambodia had lost even the appearance of independence. Its monarchy was suspended. Queen Ang May, daughter of the late King Ang Chan, was declared head of state but held no real power. Vietnamese officials ran the administration. Vietnamese customs were imposed on the court. Buddhist rituals were replaced by Confucian rites. The Khmer identity was under direct threat. The Khmer people reacted with fear, anger, and eventually resistance. Monks, nobles, and peasants alike were alienated by the cultural and political changes. Yet open rebellion was crushed quickly and ruthlessly. Trong Minh Giang's rule, while efficient militarily, became infamous among Cambodians for its heavy-handed suppression of dissent and forced assimilation. Meanwhile, Siam was not finished. Though defeated on the battlefield, it remained determined to strike again. King Rama III refused to recognize Vietnam's annexation of Cambodia. To him, Cambodia was still a legitimate vassal of Siam, and the 1834 defeat was a temporary setback. Behind the scenes, Bangkok began preparing for a new offensive, one that would come just 6 years later and plunge Cambodia into chaos once more. But in the years between 1834 and 1840, Cambodia lived under the most suffocating phase of foreign rule in its history. Its monarchy had vanished, its traditions were suppressed, its people had become subjects of a foreign empire, but the spirit of independence still burned quietly, waiting for a chance to rise again. Part 2. The 1842-1845 Offensive. Cambodia rebels. Siam returns. By 1835, Vietnam had fully annexed Cambodia. The kingdom had no independent king, no functioning royal court, and no authority over its own affairs. It had been renamed Ton Te Western Commandery, an extension of the Nguyen dynasty's growing empire. Vietnamese administrators imposed new taxes, installed their own laws, and tried to reshape the Khmer royal court into a replica of Vietnamese Confucian ideals. Khmer culture, Buddhism, and traditional customs were pushed to the margins. But foreign occupation always carries consequences. Beneath the surface, anger boiled. Resistance brewed in temples, forests, and the countryside. For 5 years, Cambodia remained under this suffocating rule until a spark ignited rebellion. That spark came in 1840. In the previous years, Queen Ang May, daughter of the late King Ang Chan, had served as a symbolic monarch. Although she held no real power, her presence maintained the illusion that Cambodia was still a kingdom. But she was under constant surveillance and controlled by Vietnamese officials in Phnom Penh. As she and her sisters came of age, tensions rose within the court and among the Khmer population. In 1840, the Vietnamese court, led by Emperor Min Mnang, made a fatal mistake. They removed Queen Ang May from the throne, stripped her of her royal regalia, and deported her and her family to Vietnam. This decision was not just an administrative shift, it was seen by many Cambodians as the final insult. With no monarch at all, the Khmer people were no longer even pretending to be a free nation. This outrage triggered open rebellion. Khmer nobles, Buddhist monks, and military officers rose up across the countryside. Local leaders rallied the population, calling for an end to Vietnamese rule. Former royal officials declared the restoration of the Khmer monarchy. Vietnamese outposts were attacked, officials assassinated, and communications disrupted. The revolt spread rapidly. Siam saw its chance. King Rama III had waited years for such an opening. Now, with Vietnam distracted by rebellion in Cambodia and problems in southern Vietnam, Siam prepared its second major invasion. But this time, it would be smarter, more coordinated, and even more focused on installing a loyal king. Siam sent Prince Angduanga, respected member of the Khmer royal family, who had lived in Bangkok for years back, into Cambodia. Siam presented him as the rightful king of Cambodia, promising to help restore Khmer independence from Vietnam. In truth, Ang Duong was Siam's chosen puppet. He had received Thai education, spoke Thai fluently, and had no political base in Cambodia independent from Siamese support. In late 1841 and into 1842, Siamese forces marched again through Battambang and northwest Cambodia. They joined the Khmer rebels in a joint campaign to expel Vietnamese troops. Skirmishes broke out along the Macau, especially near Odong and Kompong Tom. Vietnamese garrisons were overwhelmed in some areas and forced to retreat toward Cochinchina. For the first time in years, Cambodian rebels had momentum. Villagers welcomed the return of a royal figure. Monks declared the rebellion just. Ancient temples once again echoed with prayers for national liberation. In areas under rebel control, Khmer officials resumed traditional rituals, and Buddhist schools reopened. But as the fighting continued, the cracks began to show. Siam's true intentions soon became clear. Rather than supporting Khmer independence, Siam demanded that all areas under rebel control send tribute to Bangkok. Khmer nobles who refused were removed. Siamese commanders issued orders as if they were governors, not allies. Even Ang Duong's legitimacy came under question as more Cambodians realized he was merely Bangkok's candidate. Meanwhile, Vietnam regrouped. Emperor Thieu Tro, who had succeeded Minh Maang in 1841, sent fresh troops to reoccupy Phnom Penh and suppress the rebellion. General Trong Minh Giang, the same man who had overseen the earlier annexation, led the campaign. This time, however, his efforts were met with stiff resistance, not just from rebels, but from civilians, who had lost faith in Vietnamese promises of benevolence. For several years, Cambodia became a war zone once again. Neither Vietnam nor Siam could win a decisive victory. Khmer rebels controlled rural areas, but lacked the resources to take fortified cities. Vietnamese troops controlled Phnom Penh and parts of the south, while Siamese-backed forces operated in the west and northwest. The land was divided, and the people were exhausted. By 1844, the cost of war was becoming too high for all parties involved. Vietnam was facing growing instability within its own territory. Siam was concerned that its supply lines and overextended forces could trigger another Burmese conflict or internal strain. Cambodia, meanwhile, had been reduced to ashes in many areas. Negotiations quietly began between Siam and Vietnam. By 1845, an agreement was reached. Neither side would completely dominate Cambodia. Instead, both powers would recognize the restoration of the Khmer monarchy under King Ang Duong, but he would rule under a delicate, balanced Cambodia would be considered nominally independent, but both Siam and Vietnam would retain influence. This arrangement was informal, but powerful. Cambodia would no longer be annexed, but it would not be truly free. Vietnam withdrew its garrisons and accepted Ang Duong's coronation. Siam also reduced its military presence but maintained control over Battambang and other northwestern provinces. Cambodia, once again, was ruled by a king, but one placed on the throne by foreign powers. This was not independence, it was managed survival. Ang Duong himself understood the reality. He did not seek to antagonize either Vietnam or Siam. Instead, he focused on rebuilding the kingdom from within. He reopened temples, restored local administration, and re-established Khmer royal traditions. He also began writing to French officials, cautiously exploring the idea of seeking European protection to escape the Siam-Vietnam trapper vision that would later be fulfilled by his son, King Nor. For the Khmer people, the wars of the 1830s and 1840s had left deep scars. Cambodia's land had been burned, its population had been decimated, its monks killed or scattered, its royal court fragmented. The imposition of puppet monarchs and constant foreign intervention shattered public trust in leadership. Khmer identity had been battered by both Vietnamese Confucianism and Siamese domination, but the rebellion of 1840 was also a turning point. It showed that the Khmer people would rise, even under impossible odds. It proved that foreign occupation could be resisted, and while the rebellion was eventually contained, it set the stage for Cambodia's future political awakening. The twin Siamese offensives of 1831-34 and 1840-45 had failed to completely control Cambodia, yet they succeeded in one disturbing goal: keeping Cambodia trapped between two empires. The Khmer monarchy existed again, but only because it was allowed to. Its authority rested on the approval of foreign courts. The puppet strings remained, even if they were now hidden beneath royal robes. Part 3. After the Fire. A Kingdom Reborn or Redrawn. By 1845, the guns fell silent for a time. After two brutal Siamese invasions, the collapse of direct Vietnamese rule, and the near-total destruction of Cambodia's infrastructure, the kingdom had technically regained a monarch. King Ang Duong now sat on the throne, but his reign rested precariously on an uneasy balance between Siamese power and Vietnamese recognition. Cambodia had escaped total annexation but not domination. The years that followed the 1840-45 war were a period of cautious reconstruction. King Ang Duong knew that the survival of his kingdom depended not on military might, but on diplomacy, cultural preservation, and internal reform. He understood that Siam and Vietnam both viewed Cambodia as a vassal state, something to be controlled, not respected, and he knew that if he did not act wisely, Cambodia could easily be dragged into another war between the two regional giants. So Ang Duong chose a new path. He began to centralize his administration, reappoint loyal Khmer officials, and revive Buddhist institutions devastated by decades of war. Temples were rebuilt, monastic orders were re-established. Khmer art and royal ceremonies long suppressed by Vietnamese officials were reintroduced in court. Even education began to recover, with the royal court encouraging classical Pali learning and Khmer script. But Ang Duong's most strategic move was diplomatic. He quietly reached out to France. French influence had begun to spread into southern Vietnam, where the Nguyen dynasty was facing increasing pressure. French missionaries, traders, and naval officers had started mapping into Ang Duong saw in France not a liberator, but a potential balancer third party that might help Cambodia escape the eternal trap of Siam and Vietnam. In secret letters to the French, Ang Duong expressed his willingness to accept a French protectorate if it could guarantee Cambodia's sovereignty, culture, and royal lineage. He made it clear that Cambodia did not seek to become a colony, but rather needed protection from both Thailand and Vietnam. Unfortunately, Ang Duong passed away in 1860 before any formal agreement could be signed. But his son, King Norodom, inherited this strategy and finalized it just 3 years later. In 1863, under increasing pressure from both Bangkok and Huế, King Norodom signed a treaty with France. Cambodia became a French protectorate, officially ending centuries of alternating Siamese and Vietnamese control. This treaty was not without consequences. Cambodia would now be part of French Indochina, ruled alongside Vietnam and Laos. But in the minds of the Khmer court, it was a lesser evil, an opportunity to survive. The French forced Siam to relinquish the provinces of Battleground, Siem Reap, and Sizufen in 1907, territories that had been annexed by Siam during its earlier invasions. These lands were historically Khmer, and their return was celebrated as a national victory. Ironically, it was the colonizers France who restored parts of Cambodia that Siam had once seized in the name of protection. But even with the borders restored and Khmer kings back on the throne, the legacy of the Siamese offensives lingered. The twin invasions of 1831-34 and 1840-45 had done irreversible damage to Cambodia's political foundations. The Khmer monarchy had been repeatedly weakened, its legitimacy questioned by its own people. Puppet kings had been installed and removed at the whims of Siam or Vietnam. Royal succession became a game of foreign courts. The Cambodian people, who once revered their kings as semi-divine, now saw them as foreign pawns. In the countryside, the impact was even worse. The entire provinces had been villages were burned, rice fields abandoned, and ancient temples destroyed in the crossfire. Khmer peasants lived with constant fear of conscription, of taxation, of being accused of supporting the wrong prince. Tens of thousands had been displaced, some fleeing to Laos, others to Siam or Vietnam. The trauma of war passed down through generations. Culturally, Cambodia had endured attacks from both directions. From the east came Vietnamese Confucian norms, suppression of Theravada Buddhism, and the imposition of Vietnamese administrative systems. From the west came Siamese military governors, Thai language rulebooks, and attempts to make Khmer royalty conform to Bangkok's model of kingship. The result was not simply colonization, it was cultural erosion. Yet, in the ashes, Cambodia's national identity evolved. The trauma of being caught between Siam and Vietnam became a defining feature of Khmer nationalism in the 20th century. Writers, monks, and historians in the French colonial period looked back on these wars as proof that Cambodia must never again be weak, never again trust foreign powers, and never again allow puppet kings to sit on the throne. The names of the puppet rulers, Ang, Queen Ang, may became symbols of loss, of national shame, and of foreign betrayal. In contrast, figures like Ang Chan and Ang Duang were remembered as survivors flawed but determined to protect the Khmer soul. Modern Cambodian nationalism drew heavily from this memory. The idea that Cambodia had been a victim kingdom, invaded from both east and west, torn by proxy wars, and manipulated through puppet regimes, became central to the way Cambodians understood their history. It was not a falsehood, it was a truth born of lived experience. The twin offensives launched by Siam were more than military campaigns. They were part of a larger pattern, of a powerful neighbor using instability to expand its influence, install loyal rulers, and reshape the Khmer court in its own image. And while Siam failed to conquer Cambodia completely, it succeeded in weakening the kingdom to the brink of collapse. If France had not intervened, it is possible that Cambodia might have disappeared altogether, absorbed either by Siam or Vietnam. That is the haunting reality of this period. But instead, Cambodia survived. It did not rise again as an empire. It did not reclaim the grandeur of Angkor, but it endured as a people, as a language, as a faith, and as a memory. That endurance is the legacy of those who resisted, rebelled, and rebuilt Ivan while caught between two empires. Today, Cambodians look back on the 19th century not with pride, but with solemn respect. It was a century of pain, of betrayal, of repeated invasions, but it was also a century of resilience. The Siamese offensives of 1831–34 and 1840–45 remind us that wars are not always fought for justice. Often, they are waged for power, masked in the language of protection. Cambodia's story is a warning to the world. When powerful nations compete over weaker ones, it is always the innocent who suffer most. But from that suffering comes something else: memory, identity, and the quiet strength of a nation that refuses to be erased. Thank you for exploring this powerful chapter of Southeast Asian history with us. The past holds lessons that still shape our world today, and we're here to uncover them, one story at a time. If you believe history deserves to be told with truth and clarity, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. More untold stories from across the world are coming. Until then, stay curious, and we'll see you next time on the journey through history.